delighted to welcome you to our first main platform panel session of the morning, KiwiSaver 2.0. Are we moving the dial or simply moving the deck chairs? Is KiwiSaver doing the job for New Zealanders that it was set out to do? Is it fit for purpose in its current state, or do we need to make some improvements to ensure it's future-proof to meet the needs and aspirations of its more than 3.1 million members? Our panellists will discuss and debate a veritable cornucopia of topics on KiwiSaver, and to explore these themes, we have assembled a panel of experts across the regulatory, academic, research and financial services field, leaving no stone unturned. Our session is proudly sponsored by ANZ and very ably facilitated by Corin Dann, political journalist and co-host of Morning Report on Radio New Zealand. Corin will of course be a very familiar face to you, not only for his media roles, but also as a part of the FSC conference whānau for a few years now. And we're delighted that he's able to join us again this year. Over to you, Corin.
Thank you very much, Yvonne. Kia ora koutou, everybody. Your first time on the Zoom as a facilitator, so looking forward to that. I've managed to steal my 15-year-old's gaming headset, so that's all good because he's on camp. It is a great pleasure for me to be hosting this session on KiwiSaver Mark II. I had a good think about KiwiSaver. When I think about it, I'm a Generation Xer. I feel very invested in some ways, obviously not just financially, but emotionally in KiwiSaver. Most of my working life, my income has gone into a KiwiSaver fund, and it feels pretty normal and like a bit of a no-brainer. But I also am invested in the sense that I've covered this, the KiwiSaver issue as a journalist and an economics reporter for many years, and including at its inception back in, 2006, 2007 and through into 2008, when there was still quite a bit of debate about it. And I did go back and have a little look at some of the Hansards and the debates, and was surprised that actually there was so much opposition. I wouldn't say hard opposition at the time, but certainly National was sceptical to a degree, although I think John Key was always fairly into it, in the end came on board in 2008, and that sort of set it on its way. But what's interesting is that now, politically speaking, you don't see KiwiSaver as a political hot button issue topic in the sense that it would be divisive in the Parliament, and that is, I think, a good thing that is established. Where there is, of course, debate is around the evolution of KiwiSaver that we've seen over the years, the various contribution changes and these sorts of things. But it is certainly encouraging to see that it is not a political football, if you like, that it has been in New Zealand's past. So that is a good starting point. In saying that, of course, what we're here to do today and talk to this panel about is to get some ideas about whether or not the changes that have been made are fit for purpose, whether or not more needs to be done, what are the areas where there might be challenges to a saving scheme like KiwiSaver in the future. And that was brought home to me actually again with one of my sons who a week or so ago asked me to explain what NFTs are and why people weren't investing in them. And once I realized how difficult it is to try and explain a non-fungible token and why people would want to do that, it made me realize that, in the investing landscape and the world in which we live in is changing so fast. How is it that KiwiSaver and retirement savings will relate to so many of these younger generations coming through, and what they find interesting? And I know there is going to be some more discussion about some of the trends around that later on, which I'm looking forward to. So we've got our all-star panel here. I'll just run through them and then talk to you about, just very quickly, about how the format will work for this session. So we've got Adam Boyd from ASB, David Boyle from Mint Asset Management, Andrew Inwood from CoreData, and I should disclose, Andrew is my cousin, and I can vouch for the fact that he's a fantastic conversationalist, having had many a chat around the kitchen table over the years. Also, Paul Gregory from the Financial Markets Authority, and Susan St John from Auckland University. So what I'm going to do in a minute is give each of them the opportunity for about a minute to sort of introduce themselves, give a little bit of background, and maybe I think give a very quick rating if they feel like it on where they see KiwiSaver at, sort of a 1 in 10 type situation. We'll then go to a situation where we can have 5 minutes from each to flesh out some of the main issues and challenges they see for KiwiSaver, and then we'll have some time to take questions. So keep the questions coming in via the chat to do audience questions. I'll also try and facilitate some questions amongst the panel as well. So let's get underway with the introductions. Perhaps if I just start at the top of my list, Adam, if you want to kick things off.
Yeah, thanks very much, Corin, and good morning. So, Adam Boyd from ASB. I think, to the question around kind of like what am I passionate about? Look, I think bottom line, it's taking a broad and holistic approach to KiwiSaver, because I think but I think as I say that, it's important to acknowledge that everything in life's got its pros and cons, and so the same's going to be true of today's conversation. I suspect that every sort of solution that any of us put forward today is going to have some pros and some cons. The art's going to be sort of how we, I guess, get the combination of solutions to maximise the probability of success. But I think one of the things, as I say, I'm particularly passionate about is advice, and advice that's broader than just KiwiSaver. And I think the reason I'm passionate about that is because, to your question around sort of how would I rate KiwiSaver, in isolation, I'd give it a 7 out of 10. I think, on the positive side, simple proposition, one account, vanilla products. It's highly portable. That leads to good levels of competition. On a global scale, it's relatively well priced and pretty good participation, but not great. On the negatives, most people aren't saving enough for retirement. And most, like only about sort of 20 to 30% of our respondents in our surveys would say they've got a good understanding of KiwiSaver. So I think on those 2 points alone, there's some pretty big gaps. But when you look at things more broadly, and in terms of financial well-being for New Zealanders, it's not great. One of the areas I'm accountable at ASB is sort of building out our financial well-being work. And so when we were developing this, we worked with the University of Melbourne to build out an index to understand financial well-being. And so we're running that now across 600,000 customers a month. And when you look at that data, it's pretty scary. Sort of half of all Kiwis are kind of having trouble or just coping. Only about 3% of customers have got the highest levels of financial well-being, and 40% of customers have got less than $1,000 in savings. And so that's why I kind of say you can't look at this thing, KiwiSaver, in isolation, because just, I'm sure it'll come up today, higher contribution rates, and I'm actually in favour of that. But, to enable higher contribution rates, we've got to be able to help customers balance spending and savings better, pay off high interest debt, etc. And so hence my passion is to look at things more holistically. Very good. David
Boyle.
Morena, everyone. Thanks very much for getting me on this panel. For many of you that know me, I'm very passionate about KiwiSaver. I was involved right from the beginning, essentially, working with and growing the largest KiwiSaver provider. Also sitting on the education side with the Commission, and now thinking about how KiwiSaver can move from what is probably a pretty good scheme if you look at it on an international basis. We've got some great things going for it. Some of the things that we need to be thinking about is what I want to kind of touch on today. Regarding a score, it kind of reminded me when I went to Ashburton Intermediate and in my woodwork class, and my dad was a builder carpenter, so I had to kind of make sure the family was represented pretty well. Unfortunately, I didn't represent the family very well. You might see this. This is, hopefully you can see it. It is a fish. It's not a very good one, because if you look a lot closer, it's had a lot of well, I've skipped a bit of detail there, and it could have been a whole lot better. Thankfully, my woodwork teacher gave me a 7, and that's kind of where, I think he's being a bit kind, to be fair, but I think that's where KiwiSaver is today. Since 2007, it's evolved a lot. And as I mentioned, there's some great things that it has come from. But what I hope to touch on are probably three key areas that I look at New Zealanders from a full financial wellbeing perspective. And KiwiSaver is a great catalyst, but we need to wrap it and support it and help those that are in it and those that aren't to kind of build on that value. So that's what I'd love to touch on later today.
Very good. Let's go to Andrew Inwood now in Australia. Andrew.
Thanks, Corin. And well, I should point out that I am in Australia and excuse me, and do have a thick Australian accent. I was, as Corin alluded to, born in Papakura, so kia ora, everybody. I think we have to be pretty tough on ourselves when we're looking at KiwiSaver and the way in which it's acting and the way in which it behaves. And there's a couple of ways to give it scores. You can give it a score on return. And if you look at each of the individual modules in the return, it's doing pretty well. You can give it a score on service, and that score looks okay, but not great. You can give it a score on penetration, and as the previous speaker alluded to, then it's reasonably well penetrated, but not extremely well penetrated in the market. You can give it a score on engagement, and that's not as good as it could be. So as everyone's talking about, we're in positive territory. We're certainly better than a 6 out of 10, but there's a way to go to make it what it could be. I think it's really critical that we think about what its intended purpose is and what it delivers. I mean, its desire is to give people quality of life in retirement. And because of the changing nature of the way in which people are retiring, more and more people are retiring in debt, largely because of the increased property prices. So we're going to need more money in retirement unless we're going to cause a capital event at the point of retirement. So thinking about what it's designed to do, what it's delivering, making sure it's flexible, making sure we have a great mix of compulsion, education and leadership is going to be critically important. It needs to become a voice for savings and a voice for the nation. And with that, I'll hand back and give someone else a turn to talk.
Very good. Paul Gregory.
Kia ora tātou, everyone. So my perspective and passion on KiwiSaver comes from my background, I guess, which before being a regulator was asset owner and asset manager. And so my interest in it is about the potential of KiwiSaver to help people engage with their futures, and not only them, but their descendants as well. So that's what sort of informs my perspective on KiwiSaver. If I think of a score, I've heard 7 out of 10, these sort of industry forecasts, which as a regulator I need to be necessarily skeptical of, so I'll go for a 6, but that's on positive watch. So it's not as good as it could be for the reasons that the other speakers have talked about, for the people who are in it, and of course not enough people are in it. So the Minister has talked about the missing million, and of course of the default members who are transitioning right now, over half of them are not contributing either for one reason or another. So that's my score and this perspective that I bring to KiwiSaver generally. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you very much, Paul Gregory there, and we'll go to Susan St John. Susan.
Morena, Susan St John. I'm from the Retirement Policy and Research Centre, and we are very keen on looking at demographic change in the big picture of the macro implications of New Zealand super and how we're coping with an ageing population. So when I look at KiwiSaver, I think I would give it a 6 out of 10. Basically, I agree with the other speakers that there are many aspects that it's very well designed. We look at overseas schemes, for example, it's very well branded. It's got the IRD as a clearinghouse. So it's got a number of very good positive features. But I think we have to recognise that its design has got a number of inherent biases. So essentially it was designed for the working world that was applicable maybe in the 1950s and the 1960s, full-time, full career working life. It delivers well for the people who enjoy that kind of an environment. I think it is time that we took a gender lens to the design of KiwiSaver and also a Māori and Pacifica lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and I will come back to you in a second because I might flip the order for, just to give yourself a second to prepare. I'll flip the order back around for the longer part, just adding up those scores. So it looked like we came in at about a 6.5, maybe on average, a couple of 7s, 3 6s. So that sounds pretty reasonable, but work to do, obviously. The focus now is we're going to hear about 5 minutes from each of the speakers, where they will articulate 2 or 3 or perhaps more key issues they see, challenges for KiwiSaver. I'll try and keep you to about that 5-minute limit. I'll just, I'll keep you on track if we can, so we can get some time towards the end for a discussion. And so I'll flip the order back around and we'll start with Susan St John, if that's okay. Susan.
Hello. Now, I think I'm supposed to say 3 things.
Indeed.
Would improve KiwiSaver. So as I can see whether or not KiwiSaver is well designed. for the environment that we have in the 21st century, which of course involves a lot more casual work, gig work, self-employment. And then there's the role of a woman at home looking after children. And I think whatever the COVID crisis has done, it has actually shown that looking after young children is real work. But the KiwiSaver itself is not designed well for women. So when we look at that conventional 40-year career path for men, that is not the typical one for women. Typically between 20 and 40, they will take time out for caregiving, and also later on with older parents. 1 in 3 women work part-time, 1 in 10 men work part-time. For all these reasons, what we're finding is that when women enter retirement, there's a considerable gender pensions gap. So looking at 3 suggestions that might help, I think we've got to look at government contributions. So at the moment, they cease at 65, so that if you've got 40 years in the workforce, you've had 40 years of that. Why can't we say you can have 40 years of government contributions so that women working after the age of 65 can also enjoy the same level of, or somewhat the same level of contributions as others? A second example, prove it from the point of gender, is that if you're not in KiwiSaver, you don't have the, and you're working, you don't get the employer contribution. So that if we open that up and we said, look, the employer has to pay that contribution regardless of whether she's contributing or not. She may not be contributing because she can't afford to be in KiwiSaver. So why not say, if you're in KiwiSaver and you're working, you have to have the employer contribution. And a third suggestion is that we should go back and reinstate the kickstart of $1,000, because that's a very useful cushion and a very useful signal to people that they should be in KiwiSaver. And that they being rated for one reason or another, because markets change, you've at least got that cushion. It's a distributionally very sound thing to do. And unfortunately, the abolition of the kickstart in 2015 was done with no distributional analysis at all. And so it's the baby boomers who have creamed the best off of KiwiSaver, as they've done with a lot of other things.
Thank you very much, Susan. Okay, let's go back through that order then, and we'll go now to Paul Gregory. And just a reminder too for those watching around the motu that they can send in questions via the chat option, and I'll try and incorporate them as I can. Paul Gregory, now for your 5 minutes from the Financial Markets Authority. Paul.
Thanks, Corin. So investment got a bit of a global perspective on this. So investment management is changing globally. It's moving towards more value for money, more ESG, more alternative exposure, and more requirement that people fund their own retirements. There's margin pressure from investors and from regulators. There's demand for different product. There's increasing self-determination by investors who are wanting to go direct or otherwise self-serve. So from that, products need to change, the firm economics need to change, and business models need to change. Because if increasingly tech-savvy investors want to self-serve, and if they can't get what they want, or they can get it but it costs too much, then why wouldn't they look outside the investment management model? And we're seeing some of that here in New Zealand. And work done on the global future of investment management looks quite nervously towards global tech giants, for example, and wonders what would happen if they partnered with index providers. The convenience, the technology, the choice, the massive scale economics, access to digital assets, fractional access to even the most illiquid assets that's made possible by that scale-enabled liquidity. That's the context that we're looking at as the FMA when we think about value for money, when we think about funds being true to label, and core risk management capabilities like such as liquidity risk management. So if we look towards what we sort of see as a future picture that we prefer, it is where our KiwiSaver members get value for money, and that is described fairly broadly. So that's value for money in terms of returns that are appropriate for the costs that they are paying and the risk that they are taking. It is advice that helps them to make good investment decisions. It is service in whatever form they perceive that and whatever form it arrives, but we did find that service is what helps or makes a concrete contribution to a member's balance. So that's what's the value proposition of service to us. And then increasingly as well, as we're seeing in New Zealand, that investors are confident that their values are not compromised by where they are invested and how they're invested. And if we look at the value for money piece, that globally investors are moving towards those, if you look at Morningstar data, where investment managers have a rating of 3 stars or more with average or below average pricing. We're seeing those sorts of shifts in New Zealand as well, particularly in the last sort of 3 to 6 months, where a number of providers, in fact, quite a significant portion by assets under management and by KiwiSaver member have eliminated or reduced fees in that period of time, and so that's a trend that obviously we are keen to see continue, but then there are other providers as well who are dealing with the other side of the value calculus, which is adding service, adding advice, adding value for money. And so this is about directors, senior managers, and investment teams in those firms realizing that the structures that I've been using and the results that I've been getting from them are not satisfactory. So the outcomes are either poor value or value which is concealed by its cost, and that's what the industry here is increasingly moving towards addressing. And it's that kind of thinking that the FMA has been keen to encourage with our value for money guidance and the work that we've been doing with supervisors to cement this thinking as at least an annual habit for investment managers. And of course, default settings are a big part of that shift. The default member migration is underway right now. Some of it's already complete. And then those new settings are really important for KiwiSaver. The new funds have a balanced risk profile. They have quite low fees. The fees are simple. They have ESG features. They have robust engagement requirements. And this changes in nature because under the previous settings, default funds, the conservative default funds were mostly rightly seen as a parking space for members' money until they made an active choice. But with the new settings, inertia is more in members' favour, which is what default settings are actually supposed to be about from a behavioural finance perspective. So the parking space has become much more like low-cost, high-quality housing. And so our attitude towards monitoring default providers now is going to change accordingly. We used to highlight that success for default providers was about encouraging or facilitating an active choice to switch out of the default products. But now we will look at whether such switches are actually in members' interest given the setting of those funds. There's 750,000 members in balanced funds at the moment. So the other thing we'll be looking at is any barriers or any reluctance on the part of providers to accept active switches and transfers into those products given the settings of them. The new default funds were specifically designed to be open to all members, and we'll be paying close attention to that, not only in terms of the traffic, but in terms of how broadly they are made accessible and how visible they are in advertising, in websites, in disclosure documents, and in advice scripts. Another big move that we've sort of talked about as well is the move towards ESG or integrated financial products in FMA terminology. So our KiwiSaver annual report showed more than 22,000 KiwiSaver members had $554 million invested in funds that were explicitly labelled socially responsible or something similar. That, of course, significantly understates the demand for investors for funds which match their values, or perhaps more accurately, they believe match their values. A Responsible Investment Association of Australasia found in its survey of New Zealand investors that 2/3 of the 328 million run by New Zealand investment managers, and yes, that includes the super fund and ACC, were in funds self-declared, that's an important term, as practicing responsible investment. And that's about demand. And where there's demand, and especially if that demand comes with investors who are prepared to pay more for their values being reflected in their investment choices, even if they're prepared to accept a trade-off or even explicitly seek out a trade-off between financial return and environment and social return, for example, in impact products, then those investors who are prepared to do that should be confident that that's what they're actually getting. So that's why we're doing some work looking at funds that use those labels to see how they articulate what they mean by that, and to see if they can substantiate with what actually ends up in their portfolios or otherwise that they're actually living up to it. And then finally, there's what I mentioned was about core capability. So KiwiSaver providers have started to look into and get exposure to alternatives like venture, like rental property, increasingly digital assets like Bitcoin, and some providers have also got aggressive, complex style and strategies. Now, KiwiSaver is a long-term vehicle, so even in first home settings, depending on the age of the member, it's a long-term vehicle. There's no doubt that certain alternative exposures are actually a good match for that investment horizon as diversifiers or as different ways to drive growth. But they also require appropriate capability to manage the investment and operational risk that comes with those sorts of investments, particularly if the manager has the appetite to put enough of them into the portfolio so that they actually shift the dial when they perform. And core to all of that is liquidity risk management. And based on the work that we've done and communicated quite broadly with industry, there is quite a way to go to mature liquidity risk management capability across New Zealand investment managers. And that's only going to become more important as we get more into illiquids, and particularly if we see more of the sorts of volatility that has been picking up again in the markets recently. So I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Paul Gregory from the Financial Markets Authority. We'll go to Andrew Inwood now at CoreData.
Let me just unmute myself. Thanks so much, Corin. I agree a lot with, largely with everything that's been said so far. There's some interesting work around ESG globally and what that means, how it's going to act and what's going on. The only caveat I would put on the previous speaker's discussion is that ESG in a time of inflation will be very interesting. The other is that it's a social good, not necessarily an economic good. I'm pro it, but how it works and the way it's going to act is really, really challenging. The piece that I'm most interested in, for those of you who don't know who CoreData are, we're a small global research organisation very much focused on the what's happening to what we call the member, the person who's actually involved in saving and the way in which the markets are behaving and acting for them. The thing that I'm most interested in with KiwiSaver is the point around engagement. How many people are engaged in KiwiSaver, how deeply they're engaged, at what percentage of the population are involved in it, and how they're being rewarded for their engagement. We have to decide very carefully what KiwiSaver's purpose is and how it's supposed to act. There's a real risk, I think, and it's coming up a little bit in this conversation, and it's trying to solve everybody's problems simultaneously, and that it acts as a kind of beneficiary arm of government to flatten out the curve of income across the unequal opportunity which was presented to working New Zealanders. I don't think it's designed to do that. I think it's designed to help people bolster their retirement income. So we have to just be a little bit thoughtful about what its purpose is and the way in which it's designed to work. There may be a good reason to do that, but that's something that would have to be discussed at the parliamentary level rather than simply decided on by the people who operate it. There's a couple of things that I've noticed about these schemes, and we look into them all around the world. The first that I'm going to talk about is how the service piece works. One of the big issues that's facing, particularly in Aussie right now, and to a certain extent in mainland Europe and the Americas, is that funds that have focused on a low-cost provision of service facing into the end of the baby boom are finding that the low-cost service providers don't do a great job for people who are going through the process of retiring. They're really, really good at the accumulation process, and KiwiSaver appears to be really, really good at the accumulation process, but they're not great at the retirement process. It's the 5 years immediately pre-retirement and immediately post-retirement, which are very nuanced. Savings is homogenous. We have to focus on low cost, simple solutions, the way in which people put together, but retirement is heterogeneous, which means it's individual for everybody. And the only way to provide a great experience of that is to focus on the service piece. The challenge with that is that the service piece and the low price piece don't go together. There has to be some fractional way of achieving that to allow people to get better service. And David kind of alluded to it through advice as one of the ways of doing it. And perhaps welding those two pieces together is going to be really, really interesting. Susan alluded to the idea of the way of getting people into the system earlier and the effect of compounding on those processes. She's right. the effect of compounding on this is absolutely extraordinary. The earlier we can get people into the savings behaviours, whether it's with a $1,000 kickstart or keeping people's savings moving through the process, is really important. There are lots of arguments of being pro-compulsion. There are also lots of arguments for allowing people to have a nuanced view of their savings through sort of more interesting and exciting products. Where this is derailed globally is where the investments have become the playthings of investors, where they've decided that they know the future better than everybody else and start to take risks and start to bend investments in the way in which they're doing it, whether it's through political beliefs, through ESG, or whether it's through behavioural beliefs and through the sort of broad compulsion. Running those balances is really hard. I think New Zealand is doing a very good job of it at the moment, but the next generation of this has to be very different. The nature of work is changing fundamentally. Careers are much more punctuated. The nature of saving is changing fundamentally, largely forced by asset price inflation, but also forced by the people's desire to have a much more pleasurable life earlier in their lifestyle, so that we are much better consumers than we've ever been before, and largely enforced by the transfer of both positive and negative shocks being much more accelerated by the digital age that we live in. The idea that we can somehow accept and tolerate all those things inside one system has got to be something which is thought through very carefully. I think we should be focusing on the important things, getting the biggest number of people to get the best possible habits in the best way supported by the government, working very hard to engage those people as much as they can, working hard on getting a presence in their pocket, which means a reward system based on their phone to allow people to be permanently engaged in it and understanding what's going on, and managing them through the shocks. The global economic shocks are accelerating at the moment as we enter the last phase of the post-COVID inflation shocks. They're going to go around for a little while, and that's going to affect everybody, and people who have to be managed through that. In Australia, in COVID, and I hesitate to say it's different over here, we saw a lot of people withdraw their money when they were able to under the COVID pressure shocks. We've been tracking that. We're 2 years into it, and the people who stayed in the market are so fundamentally better off than those who withdrew their money. It's impossible to have that conversation without pain. And we have to make sure that we do the best for Kiwis and keeping them engaged, invested, and their eyes firmly focused on the future. And that's me out. Thanks very much, Corin.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Let's go through to David Boyle now from Mint Asset Management.
Thanks, Corin. Look, as mentioned before, KiwiSaver in its foundation is probably one of the best mechanisms to save regularly through people's hard-earned work, through the sweat of their brow, through their salary and wages. And when you look at the numbers, we've got over 3 million people in KiwiSaver, 90 billion or thereabouts invested. You'd have to think, well, we're doing okay. But it's when you peel back the layers and when you look at the information that's out there. The FMA does a great KiwiSaver report every year. It gives some really good insights around the work that they're doing, but also what advisors and I guess companies are doing in that area as well. The thing that really, really concerns me is our contribution rates, and Paul nudged on this just before, is that there are a significant number of KiwiSaver members not actually contributing or contributing very little. Now, this can be accountable for some other, pretty normal reasons. One is that we've got, 380 odd children still deemed to be children under the age of 18 in the scheme, so they're not probably making contributions. They're a retired group now that are collecting some wealth and utilising that. Unemployed, self-employed, and of course those that have gone through, I guess, the challenges of COVID, requiring the money that they need to because of their wage or demands for hardship, and also those that are just on a contribution holiday. But that really, when you add that up, there's still a large number that are not making any contributions at all. So there's no point in my view, and again, Paul touched on this too, the great work that the FMA, MB, and I guess government has revised and reviewed KiwiSaver around fees, getting the cost down, and relative to global propositions, it's pretty attractive actually. But my concern is if you got your fees down, if people aren't getting their member tax credits, and if they're not contributing, doesn't matter how good that platform is around cost and delivery, if people aren't making contributions, then that is going to actually have a massive impact on their financial well-being when they reach their, I guess, non-working years or retirement years. So I think we need to understand why. You know, I'm all for research if we actually use that research to actually do something positive and act upon. And so I guess my request is that as a country or as bodies, FSC, FMA, Inland Revenue, even member in the Retirement Commission, if they look at understanding why people aren't saving, and it could be a whole lot of reasons. The one that I fear a little bit about is how New Zealanders are being employed. And by that I mean, you know, are they getting contracted under the guise of salary and wages, but they're not meeting their commitments around KiwiSaver through the spirit of what the legislation is, which we all know is that it should be 3% on top of your salary and wages, unless individuals work with their employer and agree that it's part of their full package. I think there are a lot of New Zealanders that have been moved from salary and wages to contract roles and may have slipped or missed the point that they're not getting or receiving their employer contributions and or making any contributions themselves, perhaps, into their KiwiSaver scheme. So getting a bit of an idea on that would then bring at least a lot of the great work that's been done to date by the industry and through, you know, even the default process that the FMA has negotiated with those providers. Andrew mentioned the point that I'm very, very supportive of as well, and that is access to advice. We know that ASIC, for example, last year, I think, wrote a paper and is seeking ways to develop or create access to advice that is affordable, because at the moment it hasn't been, and the way that our legislation and I guess advice is being currently provided mitigates the access for a lot of New Zealanders who will probably need it at some stage. They just don't know it yet. So we need to develop a number of advice solutions wrapped around KiwiSaver and I guess from those that are in the financial services industry as well. And that way that they can then kind of align their goals, objectives and their personal planning, not just for retirement, but their overall well-being, making sure that they are in a good place. So it could come through a number of guises, whether it's face-to-face, by phone, by robo or digital advice, but it has to be accessible, understandable, and also in a way that can be delivered that will make a material impact to those that access it. Being in the right fund is incredibly important. We all know that the asset allocation is going to drive probably the greatest return for the investor over the lifetime of their investment. So that will determine a lot of it. But also making sure that they're meeting their own personal needs. And more importantly, as Andrew highlighted, we are genuinely entering a period of volatility that I suspect a lot of investors have not necessarily seen before. We saw the COVID impact in March and April, and the rationale of those investors that didn't have advice or support moved from growth assets to income assets and realizing their loss. Now that loss is going to be fundamental over the long term of their investment. So again, working to get all our everything aligned in a good way around our fees and proposition and making sure that we're taking into account our investors' objectives. If we're not supporting them through times when they see their balance go down, and their balances are bigger than they've ever been before, to see them drop 20%, there is a very human reaction to get out. And we've seen that time and time again. So the value of access to advice and assisting those KiwiSaver members, and we've got a truckload there, obviously, so there needs to be some ways that also, even investing, you know, a few $100s with an advisor to get them on track to support them, and then be there only if they're needed to help with that holding hand principle, if nothing else, I think will be fundamental for a lot of New Zealanders, and particularly those that are nearing retirement and perhaps scared that they've lost that asset altogether. The third part is implementing, you know, and this is more for the, you know, using the KiwiSaver system to actually improve New Zealanders' overall financial well-being in a simple mechanism, which has been proven to be very, very, you know, reviewed and attractive overseas, and that's sidecar savings, or using the contribution method from your salary or wage to other types of investments. So think of a KiwiSaver as a truck and trailer. You go, wherever you go, your KiwiSaver will follow you through your employer. The thing I'm thinking about, and we've been talking about before, is actually adding another trailer or two. One, to assist with emergency savings, massive issue in respect of those that are not being able to save regularly just to deal with those life emergencies. And if they don't, then they have to access that toxic debt or start eating their savings or their superannuation investment. Incredible impact. And again, a high cost for KiwiSaver members. So if we're able to facilitate the amazing, the inland revenue portal collection is I think, the best in the world. It covers all New Zealanders, and all you need to do is get on that line, if you like, and access it. And if that's able to provide, New Zealanders a way to save for that, but also to also build up savings outside KiwiSaver and offer a range of other investment products, again, from a regular contribution perspective, rather than waiting till they get to the lump sum or selling their business or their, I guess, changing their own environment so that they then have a lump sum, building wealth, starting early and making it really easy, and saving from your salary or wages has got to be the way to go. And we've got a cost-effective, cheap, and really, really effective way to help New Zealanders save through that central service, and allowing providers, KiwiSaver providers and others, to offer those solutions, I think, will go a long way to improve New Zealanders' overall financial well-being and mitigate the need, perhaps even for government, to support those when they are in retirement, and hopefully live a lot longer and more enjoyably along the way.
David, thank you very much for that. We'll go now to Adam Boyd from ASB. Adam.
Thanks very much, Corin. So probably just sort of 2 points, and one of them is quite similar to a point that David made. So I'll just focus on advice, and then secondly on the use of incentives. And I guess, the point on advice is, I think we certainly feel it's important to recognise, appreciate and value the provision of advice. Because, the FSC data that they've published it's pretty compelling. New Zealanders who get professional financial advice, they save 3% more of their income. They have about 50% more in their KiwiSaver account. They have 4% better investment returns. They've got better financial well-being, and importantly, they've got better overall well-being. But then again, according to the FSC data, ironically, only 18% of respondents consider themselves advised customers. And why is that? And I'm sure there's going to be many reasons for it. Access and affordability will undoubtedly be sort of a couple of the main reasons. Because, as many of us know, like good holistic advice, it takes time and it's expensive. And, as David's already talked about, and I agree, over time, digital advice will help solve this. But even digital advice is not cheap. Certainly when we've engaged with sort of leading global providers, they're charging 20 plus basis points for really high quality holistic advice. And I guess, the risk as fees get driven lower, if they end up being too low, the risk is that providers can't invest into what we need, which is really high quality advice. I think the second component on advice is sort of how it's embedded. So I guess my personal view on this is that if we charge advice separately, it potentially works against the system. So I think we know that many customers, and this is a global issue, they undervalue advice. And so I guess one of my big fears is that if we go down the path of explicit fees, it's going to lead to those who really need it choosing to not take it. And I understand all the reasons why separating these fees out is an important and good thing. I guess, like I sort of said in the open, everything's got pros and cons. But I guess I think there's a risk if we go to sort of separate fees that our customers choose to no longer take the advice. I think the second point that I just wanted to make is on the use of incentives. Because let's face it, savings is hard. And New Zealanders appear to find it really hard. So as a nation, we've got a history of just saving. On a global scale, New Zealand has just always been relatively low when it comes to savings. And then in addition to that, if you think about over the last 20 years, just globally again, companies have been focusing really hard on helping and incenting customers to spend. You think about the evolution of lending products, how easy it is now to get credit. I think online shopping, gamification of spending, buy now, pay later, the list goes on. But really, if you think about it on the other side of the coin, on the savings front, there hasn't been a lot of innovation focused on kind of the psychology or behavioral science of savings. Because if you strip it all back, savings at the end of the day is about a sacrifice today for a better tomorrow versus kind of spending today and the instant gratification that comes with it. And if you think about retirement savings, it's probably the hardest. For many, it's going to be a 40-year sacrifice. And so I guess, the point around incentives is if we really want to shift the dial on savings, incentives, whether it be sort of tax or contribution incentives or whatever else we can dream up, I think incentives have got the opportunity to be a very powerful lever to address sort of the contribution rates that some of the prior speakers have been talking about. Back to you, Corin.
Well, let's open that up a little bit, and I'll stay with you, Adam, if I can, because that raises the question of what Susan suggested, which was the Kickstarter, and whether that needs to be brought back and boosted, those sorts of government incentives to try and lift that participation rate. Is that some sort of a solution?
Yeah, I think it almost goes back to what's the problem that you want to try and solve. So I think Kickstart was a great, if the problem is how do we get more people introduced to KiwiSaver, essentially incenting them to get into the scheme, then Kickstart was a very successful tool to be used, incentive to be used. If the problem is actually we want to sort of keep people in, or we want to increase contribution rates or something, then I think there'd be different types of incentives that could potentially do that. So, for instance, lower effective tax rates would be potentially one way to hold people in the product. Maybe matching contributions if the employee increases theirs, maybe the employer needs to. There's multiple different ways that you can come at this depending on the particular problem you want to try and solve.
Andrew, from your perspective with Australia in terms of incentives, I'm curious as to what's worked there, and also what thinking there is around younger people coming into the workforce, different priorities you were talking about, different investment interests. Are there any measures that are sort of being done in Australia to try and to make sure that they get in?
Yeah, look, there's been a raft of measures all over the world. The reality is, and to Adam's point, it actually works if you separate the community on behavioural lines and you use that kind of simple post-Jungian analysis of, someone who's a controller, someone who's a worrier, someone who's an externalizer, and someone who's a coach seeker. The reality is that these systems very much favour people who take responsibility for their own future. And there's about 20% of the population always does that. They retire richer, they retire happier. You wouldn't necessarily want them around for dinner because they know a lot about accounting and mobile phone price plans, but they are actually wealthier. The challenge with that is the only thing that's ever actually worked anywhere is compulsion. And compulsion is a very interesting trick. Everyone talks about the idea of compelling the employer to play. That's wage inflation. And that means that there's not an infinite game in that. You can embrace kind of Walter Mosley's idea of modern monetary theory where the government can manufacture the money. Well, we've done 2 years of that, and we're seeing the volatility at the back end of that as we start to ride the tail of that tiger. So it's really interesting. I go back to the point that I was making earlier, Corin, and I hate to sort of beat on about it, but that idea of engagement and getting people into it really works. The thing which works most commonly and most often is that interstitial reward. If we can get a presence in people's pockets, if we can have an app on people's phones which allows people to get that kind of instant saving gratification, that's going to make a big difference. Now, there are some apps that have done a really good job of that all around the world. The Sharesies is a good one in New Zealand. There's a very good one in Australia called Spaceship and Raise, and they give you little instant rewards and little instant updates every time that those things go on. So they're giving you the behavioural feedback, and if we can get people into that, it's going to make a big difference. What
about, Andrew, when we were hearing also in the discussion about when people bailed out because they got nervous when the market started tanking but didn't stay in there? How do you deal with making sure that people are getting the information they need, the right information to hang in there in those tougher times?
So there's a couple of ways that you can deal with it. The first one is that I watched, which I'm really disappointed by, is a lot of people saw it as an opportunity to take their money, and a vast chunk of that went through the till at Kmart and also into pokies and into alcohol, which is not the intended idea for that, but to a certain extent it is their money. The idea that the government should be able to provide a loan in those circumstances and allow people to catch up is one way of dealing with that, and to create a buffer inside it where they can get access to those savings. And Ms. St John, who was on speaking on your panel, sort of spoke about that. But the compounding effect of it has been very real. The ones that I've been tracking, and I hesitate to say this, are from one particular pension fund. They were all from one particular employment group, and they've still got the money. They didn't need it, but they've kept it in cash. And of course, the market did 20% this year, and the compounding effect of missing that ride is going to be extraordinary. So it's really important. I think there's a case for compulsion. I'm pro compulsion in this case. I'm pro getting a presence in the pocket and getting interstitial rewards for people to understand the effects of what they're doing. But in terms of compelling everyone to behave in the same way, well, it'd be a pretty boring world if that was the case. So we have to kind of deal with the fact that not everyone's going to treat all opportunities equally.
Paul, if I could come to you at the Financial Markets Authority, when we think about the advice issue and ensuring people get the advice and the confidence to stay with markets when they're going through the tough patches, understanding the lifeline, the length of time they might need to invest, is that always equitable in terms of people getting the same access to that information?
So we talked about advice in our value for money guidance, and through that and through various other FMO publications, we've and through our own research actually, which echoes some of the findings of FSC, that people who get advice are happier with where they are, not just in financial terms but more broadly. And take the point as well about how it being separately priced, and particularly where it's separately priced and that structure allows it to be avoided, means that people with low balances in particular find it that it doesn't, or in their view, it doesn't make economic sense to them to pay for it, which is a quite short-term perspective. Our issue is less about how the cost of advice is structured. We have said explicitly in our guidance that we are okay with either, provided there actually is an advice offering. And it's not just about an introduction cost, effectively, where the KiwiSaver provider is actually paying somebody to introduce somebody to their scheme, and that's where the advice, the discussion, the engagement ends, even if the cost doesn't, because it can be ongoing. So I think that there is definitely a need and in KiwiSaver and investment generally for advice, because of the fact that it is a hard thing to do. It's very hard in behavioural terms. You can teach people to budget. It's very difficult to teach them to choose and continue to manage financial products like investment products.
Sure. Well, let me go,
because it can be complicated.
Sure. If I could go to Susan St John, a question's come in here actually on the chat saying, which is interesting along those lines, do you think, and anyone else can jump in on this too, but I'll start with you, Susan, do the panel think members should be allowed to draw some funds from their KiwiSaver account each year to obtain advice?
Well, that's only going to further erode the small balances that people have. It would be much better to make financial advice freely available under certain circumstances, in my view.
Anyone else have a view on whether or not that money should come out of the KiwiSaver fund? David, Adam?
Yeah, look.
Can I jump in there, Corin?
Sure.
Sorry, David, go ahead. I was just going to say that financial advice isn't, I don't know if it's a fully protected term in New Zealand yet. I mean, financial advice isn't an evenly distributed skill. There are people who are good at it, there are people who are bad at it, and there are people who set out, for whatever reason, as they do in every industry, to set out as a way to actually just make themselves rich. And they're not the people that you want to be working in. There are places for financial advice, and it's incredibly important, and done well is an absolute superpower. But eroding small balances to get advice is possibly worth it, but there's probably better ways to do it, either through taxation relief or income relief, or government-provided services which allow it to do it. To open that up to financial services would mean that it could potentially be exploited. David, I'll hand over to you at that point. I'm sorry to have interrupted you.
Yeah, no, it's all good. It is a topic, not just New Zealand, Australia, internationally, are all dealing with how, I guess, investors kind of cope with market volatility, but also making sure they're in the right fund, and also that their plan is in place. Let's be honest, it's a pretty boring bloody topic for most people until they start getting a reasonable balance, and then start thinking about how do we turn that balance into something that they can see what it will provide. And there's been, again, some great work. The FMA changed that annual statements to show what people might have at the end, rather than just seeing what they've got today. I mean, so there are a lot of tips that you can add to, but I think there will come time when you need to have be able to call or talk to someone or have access to information that will be personalised, because everyone's needs are different, and their circumstances, age and stage. It's not an easy solution. I don't think there's a silver bullet. I think you provide a range of opportunities, and let the investors choose, perhaps, but also make sure that you provide those options and don't just set and forget.
Adam, did you want to add on that?
I guess some really good points made. I can't help but think that if that was available, that there would be some customers who took it up who may be the ones that need it least, and that a lot of the customers who genuinely really need it may not actually take up that opportunity. And so I can't help but think there needs to be a level of advice that needs to be sort of, I say, embedded into the products. I just think it's so fundamental. When you step back and look at KiwiSaver in entirety, advice is just such a fundamental component of it that to have the notion of KiwiSaver without advice, I'm just not sure how that really produces the right outcomes for clients.
Alrighty, well, look, we've come towards the end of the session. I just want to make a special thanks to all of the panel this morning. So we were speaking to Susan St. John from Auckland University, Paul Gregory from the Financial Markets Authority, Andrew Inwood from CoreData, David Boyle from Mint Asset Management, and Adam Boyd from ASB. It's clear that KiwiSaver, early on, we saw the rankings was coming in from the panelists at around 6.5 to 7. It's a good scheme. It's going well, but there's lots to do and lots to think about with a changing world and a changing investment environment. I want to thank you all once again for tuning in, and I'll hand back to you, Yvonne.
Great. Thank you, Corin, for your expert facilitation of our panel discussion, and maybe you can get in a quick game of Xbox before handing back your headset to your 15-year-old. Thank you also to the panellists for a very thought-provoking and informative session. With the current movement of hundreds of thousands of default KiwiSaver members to their new providers, it's very timely to hear the views of our panellists around how best to engage with KiwiSaver members in a meaningful way and what improvements should be considered. Our panellists explored their own areas of expertise and conviction, with Adam from ASB expressing his passion for the provision of access to good holistic advice, be that face-to-face or digital. David echoed these thoughts, but also with a challenge to the industry to address the issue of contribution rates to encourage participation for all. Paul's view from the regulator with a message for product providers to make sure your offer is true to label and stacks up with what it says on the tin. Susan gave us a flavour of the issues facing women who are already on the back foot when it comes to saving, and suggested that the $1,000 kickstart should be reinstated. And lastly, Andrew suggested that global research shows low-cost providers do a great job in the accumulation phase, but possibly need to do a better job at the retirement phase. So lots to think about, and a very engaging session indeed, as we consider the next phase for KiwiSaver. I'd now like to introduce Sarah Beauchamp, Head of Wealth Strategic Initiatives for ANZ, for a few words of thanks for our panellists. Over to you, Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beauchamp, Head of Wealth Strategic Initiatives at ANZ. I'm delighted to be here today supporting the FSC conference. I'd like to extend a huge thank you to all the panellists for an engaging and vibrant discussion. At ANZ, we're all about improving the financial well-being of our customers, and the discussion really went to the heart of that. I know that all of us in the industry feel the responsibility deeply of how to help Kiwis optimise their retirement outcomes, which is why Adam's kick-off to the session summed up for me what we all grapple with day to day, in the smallest design decisions to the largest strategic decisions, which is every solution has pros and cons. The art is in how we get the combination of solutions for success. And Andrew touched on the idea of trying to contain too many things within the one system, that we have to focus on the most important objectives, which ties very closely to getting to the right combination of solutions. So thank you again to all the panelists for providing us with some great food for thought. It's been another big year in the KiwiSaver world, so I'd like to wish everyone a well-earned Christmas break.
Great. Thank you, Sarah, for those kind words for our speakers.